hybrid session. A special thank you for Ryan PhD committee. Professor Mehran Mesbahi joined through Zoom, and Professor Pranay Destinis also through Zoom, and Professor Eric Shea Brown here in person. So in his thesis, Ryan investigated the connection relation between dynamical systems methodology and neural networks that are dynamic. These neural networks process data that is time variant and could be expressed as time series or as sequences. What is interesting about these neural networks is that dynamical systems methodology wasn't developed, classical theory wasn't developed for these systems. These are more complex. And it is interesting to see which types of analysis apply to them, which needs to be extended, and how to extend them. In particular, Ryan studied the Lyapunov spectrum analysis that is applied to recurrent neural networks, and you will hear more from Ryan on this topic. A major part of this work was done in collaboration with Professor Guillaume Lajoie at UDM Montreal and Milan, and his group. We are very thankful for this collaboration. Also, I wanted to acknowledge support and funding from UW Computational Neuroscience Center and the AxelNet program, the A3D3 Institute, and the UW Applied Math department. Right, with these notes, I'll just mention that this thesis defense will include 3 components. The first component is the general session, and then followed by QA. Then we'll transition to committee discussion and QA with the candidate, and then we will transition to committee discussion. Right, without further ado, Ryan, take the stage.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. So I will get started now in going through my thesis entitled Interpretation and Optimization of Recurrent Neural Network Performance through Lyapunov Exponents Methodology. Okay, as Eli mentioned, this work primarily is interested in uniting 2 related topics, or at least just demonstrating that they are related, those topics being dynamical systems and recurrent neural networks, or RNNs. So I'll start by describing the field of dynamical systems, or at least the motivation behind it. This comes primarily, is developed in the context of nonlinear systems and is motivated by the fact that nonlinear systems can exhibit very complex behavior, which makes solutions to these systems very difficult or sometimes impossible to determine analytically. The dynamical systems can take a variety of forms, whether you have a discrete system where the next step of a variable is dependent on some function, usually nonlinear, of the previous time step of that variable, or you can have a differential equation where the derivative of that function, or sorry, the derivative of that variable is a function of that variable, or of that variable. Therefore, because these solutions are very difficult to or impossible to calculate, dynamical systems is more concerned instead with the geometry or the dynamics of those trajectories, rather than solving for them explicitly. This can come in the form then of the identification and classification of fixed points by performing bifurcation analysis of particular parameters of that system, by identifying basins of attraction, so where nearby trajectories tend to go towards each other or might diverge from each other, and then observing asymptotic behavior, so what the trajectories will do after a very long period of time as t goes to infinity. Of course, there are many other aspects of dynamical systems, but I just want to point out a small sample of what they are here today. So one way that we can view this, these trajectories as asymptotically evolving is by considering trajectories that start nearby to each other and what they do over time. So let's consider here this toy 2-dimensional dynamical system outlined by this gray line, which starts on the left-hand side here at this gray dot. Now that gray, we can consider 2 other trajectories which start close to that gray dot, and the distance between the 2 nearby trajectories and this point in time is measured by these red and blue arrows. Initially, we're going to set these arrows to be orthogonal to each other. And then as we project this forward in time, these trajectories could move or could evolve alongside this, this gray line. But the distance between that gray line and these nearby trajectories can change either by rotating, by stretching, or contracting. In general, these effects can compound over time such that as t goes to infinity, you might have wildly diverging values in terms of the distance between these, depending on which direction you start in. So in order to measure, as time goes to infinity, how these distances grow or contract over time, we have a well-known metric within dynamical systems called the Lyapunov exponents. Now, primarily, Lyapunov exponents were developed as a metric for chaos or linear stability of a dynamical system. This is primarily comes from the first Lyapunov exponent, which we'll call lambda1, where the distance between those nearby trajectories will tend to grow asymptotically as e to the lambda1t. Now, in this case, we then find two possible or two primary results that can emerge from this for this distance as time goes to infinity. If this first Lyapunov exponent is greater than 0, then that distance will become infinity, which is indicative of chaos there. Instead, if it's less than 0, then the distance will over time, e to the negative infinity is 0. This means then that those nearby trajectories will go to the same point over time, which would be a fixed point. In the case where we have an ergodic system, which is a system in which all points in the state space are visited uniformly and randomly, these exponents are deterministic, meaning that every point, regardless of what our initial point is that we start at, all of them will have the same Lyapunov exponents. I want to note here that while I have described this first Lyapunov exponent, for an n-dimensional system, the number of Lyapunov exponents that that system has is equal to n. So, for example, if we have, as you'll see this plot later, later in this presentation, if we have, say, a 500-dimensional system, then we would have 500 different Lyapunov exponents corresponding to those different directions. Typically, the organization of our Lyapunov spectrum will be that the earlier indices of that spectrum will be our largest Lyapunov exponents corresponding to the greatest expansion or the least contraction, until we get to the very end where very negative numbers mean a very fast rate of contraction. Having described now the topic of dynamical systems, I then want to turn our attention towards the other field that we're looking at here, which is recurrent neural networks, but I'll start with a general description of the training of neural networks. The typical setup here is a network is provided with an input. That input is then processed through the hidden layers of this network in order to produce a prediction in the form of an output. That output is then compared to the target associated with the input, and then the difference between these two values will then give us a loss, depending on what function we're using for this loss. In order to perform this, the training, we then need to backpropagate this loss through all components of this network, and we track the contribution of each weight or each parameter of this network to this final loss value in order to acquire the gradient. Having determined that gradient, we then perform training by updating our parameters of our network according to, by accounting for this contribution to the loss in an attempt to reduce the actual difference between our prediction and target and thus reduce the loss. Recurrent neural networks are a particular form of this system, which specialize primarily in, as Eli said, processing sequential data. It's able to do this by maintaining hidden states, which are denoted by this h of t, which operate as a form of, you could think of it as like the memory of the system. These h of t are operated on by a single function at every time step called a, which modifies both the hidden state based on its previous time. So we see a sequence of these h's. So it processes both the previous time step as well as some additional signal input here in the form of this x. It has been well established in that there's a lot of difficulty in learning these dependencies as they evolve over very long sequences. But work in the study of recurrent neural networks whether developing different architectures or different training mechanisms have been used to help to mitigate some of these issues, which have made it so that these can be used in a wide variety of applications in everyday life, such as you might see with language modeling, machine translation, speech recognition, or there are scientific applications in things like sequence prediction or modeling of neurological or brain systems. So having seen both of these sides of the spectrum here with the analytical framework of dynamical systems and the application of recurrent neural networks, I want to point out how when looking at this equation for the processing, or how an RNN actually processes its memory forward in the form of these hidden states, it is a function. So the hidden state at time t is a function of the hidden state at the previous time step, which is very similar, referring back to a previous slide, of this discrete time dynamical system. However, what we didn't have in that previous setup was this additional aspect here, which is the added signal x of t. Because of this additional added signal, this becomes a non-autonomous discrete time dynamical system. And we're curious with the dynamic, or we're investigating the dynamic variable h of t here, while acknowledging that there is this additional input signal. Therefore, there is more recent work that has shown that we can use the concept of random dynamical systems to account for the sort of random effects that can come from this input signal. Therefore, given this framework here, we propose and will, for the rest of this work, demonstrate how we can use the framework of dynamical systems to analyze the propagation of information in these kinds of networks. Specifically, we'll be using the aforementioned Lyapunov exponents. One other aspect that's worth noting here is I pointed out the process of training by getting those gradients and updating our networks. We are, as a result of doing that, also updating the parameters of these networks and therefore affecting the dynamics of this dynamical system. So that means that we expect to see that reflected in the Lyapunov exponents over the course of training. So with that, I'll dive into the first section demonstrating some results that we got over the course of this work. This section is entitled Lyapunov exponents of recurrent neural networks in relation to performance. This section was motivated primarily by three questions. How can Lyapunov exponents be computed efficiently for RNN architectures? How does the Lyapunov spectrum of RNN evolve over training? And how do Lyapunov exponent statistics relate to RNN accuracy? So I'll start here by outlining the algorithm for computing the Lyapunov exponents for RNNs. We start by initializing the hidden states, that's the memory variable there, as 0, so that we effectively treat our memory as a blank slate. I know I like to do that every once in a while. And then we initialize this initial matrix Q to represent our initial perturbations from our starting point of our dynamical system. This is analogous to those two red and blue arrows that I showed earlier in this presentation. We then want to calculate J here, which is the Jacobian or partial derivative of our system. Specifically, we're finding the partial derivative of the hidden state with respect to the hidden state at the previous time step. That gives us a linearization of our recurrent neural network. And then we multiply that by our perturbation matrix Q in order to evolve those perturbations forward. That's the equivalent of the stretching and contracting at each individual time step of those arrows. We then perform a QR decomposition on that product in order to extract what the next step of those Qs will be. We reorthogonalize that. And then this R, what's stored in the R values here, will be how much those arrows were stretched or contracted in that single time step. We then find the cumulative effect of all of these stretching and all these stretches and contractions by taking the mean. Well, we'll divide by our total number of time steps and take the mean in a single direction for that. So I'll note that this is these R values here will also be ordered. So the first for I equal to 1 here, that will be our largest expansion factor, or the most positive, and then they will decrease over the course of that. Therefore, that will make it so that these lambdas will also be ordered in that same way. Okay. So when we perform this calculation on our recurrent neural networks over the course of training, we find some interesting patterns emerge. First of all, before any training has occurred, so that's epoch 0, we find that these networks in general will tend to have a more flat shape, while they do have some variety in themselves in how each of these individual spectra might arrange themselves at first. We find that after some training has occurred, so to epoch 4, we get that a much steeper shape emerges. More so when we train for an additional 11 epochs, while these shapes have also continued to change, the difference between the 4th epoch and 15th epoch is considerably less in terms of gross shape than you see between the 0th and 4th epoch, despite there being more training occurring in that stage. This is consistent with the fact that early in training, we tend to have a greater decrease in the loss, and then you have more fine-tuning that occurs later. This is reinforced by the fact that, for example, when we look at the mean exponent, it converges very quickly in training, and then you have more fine-tuning as you get later in the training process. We then want to investigate how, since we have demonstrated on the previous slide that there is this relation between loss decreasing and the general shape of these exponents and these spectra, we then look at, for particular tasks, how the final loss of a network after it is trained relates to particular statistics of the Lyapunov spectrum. So for our first task, we consider a character prediction task, which we title char RNN, where it is tasked with taking a stream of letters. So in this case, the original object, and then has to guess what the next letter is. The correct value would be N. And so it makes predictions of how confident it is for each of these guesses here. So in this case, we find that the statistic of the Lyapunov spectrum that correlates best with the loss of the network is the maximum Lyapunov exponent. More specifically, as the maximum Lyapunov exponent gets larger, or in this case, closer to 0, because they're all negative in this case, then the loss tends to get better, or it gets lower, which means the accuracy is higher. For our second example, we consider a different case where we have a sequence prediction task on CMU mocap data. This data is kind of like what's shown here. There are sensors placed on different joints of a person, and then as that person moves, the network is tasked with guessing at one time step forward where all of the joints will be located. In this case, rather than the maximum Lyapunov exponent, we found that the mean value of all Lyapunov exponents was the statistic that had the greatest correlation with loss. So in this case, we found that decreasing the mean Lyapunov exponent tended to have the strongest correlation with or tended to lead to a decrease in the loss and an increase in the accuracy. We then go on to, in this case, where we'll do a deeper investigation into the character prediction task to demonstrate that over the course of training, which here is shown by increasing opacity of these points here, that once we get past a certain threshold in the training or of this statistic in the Lyapunov spectrum, the advantage or the amount that you sort of decrease your loss and improve your accuracy can degrade and you get diminishing returns. Specifically, we find that once we increase the maximum Lyapunov exponent above -0.5 over the course of training, even as training continues to progress, there are not significant improvements to the loss after that. For the same task, we find that for the mean Lyapunov exponent decreasing below -4.3 also has these diminishing returns. Another thing worth noting about this is these are two particular statistics of the Lyapunov spectrum of a set of maybe 5 to 10 that we were looking at. But one thing that we realized in doing this was choosing the statistics that we want to measure and that we try to find these correlations with does introduce a form of bias in itself, because we're only limiting ourselves to what we're choosing to measure there. So instead, for this next work, we decide to take a different approach in order to discover this relation between the Lyapunov spectrum and performance. So this section is entitled Inferring Network Performance Through Lyapunov Exponent Representation. The questions motivating this section are: which Lyapunov exponent features are most indicative of network accuracy for a given task? And can these features be learned with a data-driven approach across a wide variety of network hyperparameters? So I'll just outline a brief sort of toy example of, or one initial approach that we could take to trying to learn this relation. So I set across network hyperparameters. One such hyperparameter that we could consider is the size of our network. And specifically, I'm talking about the number of hidden states, the size of sort of that memory variable that we're considering here. So the number of dynamic variables. And so if we consider 4 different sizes, training once again on this character prediction task, then unsurprisingly, we find that the largest network, which tend to have the most flexibility, will have the lowest, are able to achieve the lowest loss. And then as this size size decreases, the maximum accuracy that you can achieve tends to get a little bit worse. However, while these are able to achieve the most optimal loss, these larger networks do have a greater degree of sensitivity to the choice of initialization parameter, which is what defines the distribution from which the weights of your recurrent weight matrix are sampled. So the question that we have here is, while the shapes across these different sizes of recurrent neural networks for these Lyapunov spectra are quite similar here, can we use just these spectra to predict and recreate this plot here, this parametric dependence? So in order to do that, we train what we call a prednet here, which is a fully connected neural network, which takes as input only the Lyapunov spectrum of these recurrent neural networks and is asked to predict the corresponding loss of the network from which that Lyapunov spectrum was calculated. What we find in doing that is it is quite successful in finding some very coarse patterns here. Most importantly, we do find the same ordering where we have the blue dots on top and then the orange, green, and red below them in that order. Most notably also, we find that the location at which these initialization parameters, the initialization parameters at which the size 512 networks and the size 256 networks begin to see a decrease in their accuracy or an increase in their loss are also pretty correctly identified using this approach. I want to point out specifically, this neural network here is provided no specific information about the size of the network that it was provided or the initialization parameter. Only it is given the Lyapunov spectrum associated with the loss that it effectively eventually has to output. So what we can conclude from this is that through some data-driven approach, we are capable of using a prednet kind of like this as a Lyapunov exponent feature extraction tool as it relates to performance. But to perform some additional analysis and perhaps develop a stronger intuition and better relation between these, we propose a more robust representation using not just a simple, fully connected neural network, but instead use an autoencoder. So an autoencoder here is primarily consisting or generally is defined in 3 parts. The first part is the encoder, which is tasked with taking the input, which in our case, we're looking at the Lyapunov exponents as the input. It then projects that input into a low dimensional representation or a latent space, which is the purple here. And then that latent representation is generally lower dimensional, hopefully by a considerable margin relative to your initial input. The third component then is the decoder, which takes that low dimensional latent representation and is supposed to reconstruct or attempt as accurately as possible to reconstruct the initial input that was given to the encoder. In order to calculate the loss here, we then look at the difference between our output, the z hat, and the input z, which gives us our reconstruction loss here. For our work here, we introduce an additional layer on top of this by taking the representation in this low dimensional space and having a linear function, which takes the latent space and from that tries to predict what the accuracy of that network will be, or what the accuracy of the corresponding network that the Lyapunov exponent spectrum that was input to would be. So in that case, we have, for the loss, in this case, we compare the predicted accuracy of that network to what the actual accuracy of the network corresponding to the input was. So in that case, we have, for our full loss of this autoencoder system, we have the reconstruction loss, which is z minus z hat, plus some regularization parameter alpha times our prediction loss here. Importantly, in this representation, we can extract additional information from that low dimensional representation in the latent space. One, it can be also very helpful for visualization to do a further projection, in this case into 2 dimensions, so we can put it on a screen. In this case, we use principal component analysis, but other projections could be useful for visualization. When presenting this, we choose to label our networks according to whether their accuracy was high or low accuracy, which is dependent on the task, how we define that. And notably, since we're using this linear layer here, which is needing to make a distinction within the latent space in order to make an accuracy prediction, we anticipate that we will be seeing a clustering of these networks where the high accuracy networks will be close to each other, and then the lower accuracy will be close to each other, so that that linear layer can perform as easy a prediction as possible. So we demonstrate this on a couple choices of tasks, and then by varying some different hyperparameters. The first case, we look once again at that same character prediction task with these same network sizes, 64, 128, 256, and 512. And what we find by doing this is that, as predicted, we get this separation in this low dimensional space of the left side having primarily the high accuracy networks and the right side having primarily the low accuracy networks. We can see in the histogram down below that along the first principal component direction of this projection, we see a high concentration with very almost exclusively the green bars here. And then as you get to the very far right side of this plot, it's entirely red. This is in contrast to the distribution according to the the network size, in that we have a more uniform distribution, or at least a mixed distribution of network size across most of this first principal component. When we then compare this to a different network hyperparameter, in this case being network architecture, then we find a similar organization. Now, in this case, we're considering a different task. This is sequential MNIST. So what it's given is, it's given an image of a handwritten digit, and it's trying to predict what digit that actually is that's written there. Now, we consider 8 different network architectures here. This just means that the equations and how the weights are sort of interacting with the H and the X are a little bit different in all of these. There are 3 classical ones that are most commonly used. So RNN, GRU, and LSTM are either your vanilla network, or a couple gated ones that have been around for a while that are robust for learning long-term dependencies. But then there are also additional networks that are more dynamically constrained to ensure that for example, the Lyapunov exponents are close to 0, but more specifically, they're intended to have long-term projection of that memory. So what we find here in this representation is, once again, we have the concentration of high accuracy on the right, low accuracy on the left, even as the mixing, or even as the many different architectures are mixing with each other in this space. Notably, we also find, for example, this blue cloud, it's very clear that for LSTMs, we have effectively a spectrum that's formed. One additional hyperparameter that we can consider this over is, once again, in the sequential MNIST task, wanting to leverage that property that we pointed out in the previous section, that many of these Lyapunov spectrum properties can emerge early in training. We want to see, can we make predictions based on that observation? So specifically, we want to find, based on the Lyapunov spectrum early in training, can we predict, after all training has occurred, whether that network will have high accuracy or low accuracy? And in this case, we're able to find a high degree of success. And if we form a classifier where it's just tasked with saying high accuracy or low accuracy, in particular, we want to point out that after only 20% of training, so 4 epochs out of 20, that we're able to get a classifier using this AELLE method that has an F1 score of 0.9. And we show that that is a more accurate classifier than using just simple Lyapunov exponent statistics, such as the mean, the max, or just performing principal component analysis on the entire Lyapunov spectrum. Additionally, I want to just show in a little bit more detail what it is that this low dimensional representation is actually encoding in this latent space. So here I'm showing some examples of some of these spectra for each of the different architectures that we were considering. And I want to point out in particular that there's a clustering of a few different architectures here at the top. So we have the light blue, which is ASRNN, pink, which is the Lipschitz RNN, yellow or gold, which is the noisy RNN. And then what you actually can't see is that co-RNN is pretty much directly below the ASRNN. However, if you go in this space here, you find that there's an interesting outlier in that the GRU, which is this more olive gold color, maybe not super clear on the projector, that this is actually clustered or grouped close to all of these other ones, which seemingly are close to indistinguishable, at least visually, in this plot on the left-hand side here. However, when we look then at the performance or the accuracy of these networks in this space, it becomes a little bit more clear why it is that GRU is placed with those as opposed to the other networks, particularly with the other gated networks like LSTM. And what we find is that we have 4 dots that have that are colored in green because they have very low loss. Those specifically are GRU with the ASRNN, Lipschitz, and noisy RNN. Whereas the ones that have worse loss will, as we saw in the previous section or previous slide, tend to be further to the left in this space. So this leads to some interesting conclusions that we can clearly see, as hypothesized previously, that there is an organization in this space that is primarily influenced by the network accuracy and network performance, more so than what we might visually investigate in the Lyapunov spectrum. So for the final section of the results here, I want to take a step back. And instead of looking at a large number of networks and comparing losses and sort of the final results of training, I want to look in more detail into how the components and how the computation of these Lyapunov exponents relates to the actual process of training and those gradients that I described in the training slide. So this section is entitled Linking Finite Time Lyapunov Exponents to RNN Gradient Subspaces and Input Sensitivity. We have 3 questions that motivate this work. We have, how does computation of Lyapunov exponents over time relate to loss gradients of RNN? How does the geometry of approximate Lyapunov vectors compare to gradient directions? And how does expansion and contraction of hidden state spaces indicate the network's sensitivity to input? So I'll start here, some scary equations to outline how we get this gradient and point out some important relations here. So first, I've just broken down the RNN into some component parts, so it's easier to pick out certain things here. So first of all, we have the V here is our recurrent weight matrix, and it's being multiplied by the H here. If we want to find what is the gradient or what's the contribution to the loss of this V, notably, we find that it is dependent on the gradient with respect to actually the hidden state itself, which the gradient of that hidden state can be written as or depends on a potentially quite long product of Jacobians here. These are those Jacobians which are the partial derivatives of those H's. I bring up those Jacobians because they pop up in the calculation of our Lyapunov exponents as a reminder. Now, classically, and as I mentioned before, Lyapunov exponents are traditionally defined as asymptotic quantities, so only for t being very large. But if we instead think of Lyapunov exponents as something that evolve naturally over the course of a sequence, then we can use a different framework to view them instead as a sequence that forms these finite time Lyapunov exponents. Specifically, what we'll be doing differently algorithmically here is calculating or storing these Qs, which are those perturbations as a function of time, or at each step in time. We'll be storing each of those and indexing them as Q sub t. When we do that, and we perform this QR decomposition at this stage here, we get that this QT-RT is equal to JT QT minus 1, which notably, if we can rearrange this here, we find that we can express this Jacobian as a product of Q, R, and then Q at the previous time step. This means if we go back to the expression we had previously, I mentioned that potentially very long product of Jacobians. We can then rewrite that product by replacing these Jacobians with the QRQ product that we had previously. This then yields this following product, where instead we actually get a lot of cancellation of many of these Qs, where all that we're left with is the final, so S, Q, and then the initial one, this Q sub T, and then this long product of R's in the middle. This, through this framework then, it inspired us to think of these in a slightly different way. We view these Qs potentially as a way to form a sort of basis for the gradient at a particular time step. So the question that we can ask from that, and that we'll be investigating, is how do these Q vectors align with what we call the dominant directions of the gradient, which I'll define on the next slide. And then with these R's, which have even previously were representing the degree of expansion and contraction at each step in time, can we use these, can we leverage these to identify locations of network input sensitivity? So we'll start by defining what we mean by dominant directions of the gradient. So we start by decomposing this gradient using singular value decomposition and defining in this case the first five singular vectors corresponding to the 5 largest singular values as the dominant directions of this gradient. So now that we have that set of vectors, we are comparing them to the set of vectors that we get from these Qs, and we have 3 different sets that we're looking at. So either the first, we're looking at 10 each, so the first 10 Q vectors corresponding to the directions of greatest expansion, the last Q corresponding to the directions of greatest contraction, and then some random set of 10 Q vectors that is somewhere not among those 2 sets. Notably, I want to point out that this cosine similarity can range between -1 and 1, with 0 being orthogonal, 1 being anti-parallel, or sorry, 1 being parallel, -1 being anti-parallel. It is, we expect in a high dimensional space, due to the concentration of measure on the sphere, that you will tend to have most of these vectors should be relatively close to orthogonal, so they should have an alignment close to 0. Because we expect a concentration around 0, we can measure the degree of sort of deviation from that 0 by measuring the standard deviation of these distributions of alignments across these combinations of sets. When we look at an untrained network, regardless of which set of Q vectors we are considering here, we find the standard deviation is rather consistent across all of them. However, once we perform additional training, we find that the standard deviation for the first 10 Q vectors, where we have the most expansion, becomes increasingly aligned, or standard deviation increases meaning that the alignment is increasing or orthogonality is decreasing with the dominant directions of the gradient. Meanwhile, the directions which are correspond to the most contraction become more orthogonal, as shown by the decreasing standard deviation of this distribution. We also see for these random vectors that we have a smaller but decrease, but also a decrease here. Having seen how these sets of 10 Q vectors each operate in aggregate, we then want to see how does this relation of these standard deviations, how is this a function of the actual Q vector index, which I'll remind you the Q vectors, the smallest index corresponds to the greatest direction of expansion. So once again, if we look at the untrained version at epoch 0, we find this red line is saying what it is for just a random set of vectors. We find that there's a concentration of these standard deviations around this random value. However, once we perform training, we see a pattern that emerges here where early on, or for these early Q vector indices, the standard deviation gets pulled upward such that they become increasingly aligned, and then decreases gradually such that the very late indices have very small standard deviations and are more orthogonal. When we instead look at the last 5 singular vectors, these are what, if we're saying these are the most dominant directions, you could say these are the least dominant directions of the gradient, the ones that seem to contribute the least to the loss. We find that whereas most of the Q vectors have returned to sort of this random, a concentration around this random value, the early Q vector indices are actually more orthogonal to these directions. So with this, or seeing then that these directions that have the greatest degree of expansion tend to align the most with the dominant modes of this gradient, we then try to see how we can leverage that by identifying those locations and measuring, therefore, the input sensitivity. So that's what we do next here. So I'll start here by outlining an algorithm that we use in order to introduce perturbations to our input. So we start by using the maximal R values. And in this case, I'm saying over the course of a sequence, which has a length of, in this case, it's 784, we want to locate, we'll say 100, the 100 pixels or the 100 locations in that input at which the R value is the largest, which means we have the greatest expansion in the hidden state space there. Having identified the pixels at which point those take place, we have those largest R's, we then perform a flipping algorithm. If initially that pixel has a grayscale value of 0, meaning it's black or it has no input there, then we perform what we call an upflip, where we turn that pixel from value of 0 all the way up to a value of 1, the brightest it can be. If it's non-zero, however, we then we downflip that pixel and turn it from having some color to all the way off, it's now black. So we can see the result of flipping 100 of these pixels on the, in the comparison between these two. You'll see that there, at least in these examples, there are considerably more upflips than downflips, but there are some places where you can definitely see some pixels have been turned black. What we then do is we compare to test the sensitivity to these perturbations. We look at the loss of the network as a result of being given this perturbed input versus what the loss was when given just the original unperturbed input. So what we show here is that as a function of the number of pixel flips, these blue dots are all representing the difference between the perturbed loss, or the loss based on the perturbed input, against the loss based on the original input. And as we would have predicted, pretty much all of these are positive values here. But to compare it to what extent this is actually statistically significant, we compare this then to if we selected an equal number of randomly selected pixels. And we do this for 50 different samples of randomly selected pixels and flip those according to that same algorithm described previously. What we find here is that when we're between 20 and 200 pixels that have been flipped, on average, the R value based perturbations give a slightly greater increase in the loss. But then when we limit it, or specifically when we look at 75, 100, and 200 pixel flips, we get actually a statistically significant increase in loss when performing the R value flips relative to performing random flips on average. In particular, we note that this 100 achieves a p-value of 0.024, which is considerably lower than our baseline or our threshold for significance of 0.05. So to investigate the effect that this has on particular inputs and predictions from the network, we then look at our comparison between our original predictions and our outputs. So here we find what we're showing here is that the black bar is what the network predicts based on the original unperturbed input. We can find in both cases that it guesses the correct label of 4 on the top and 9 on the bottom. However, once we introduce these perturbations on 100 of the 784 pixels here, we find that the network is predicting a different label in both cases, as demonstrated by this blue bar. So in the top case, it's predicting a 6. In the bottom case, it's predicting a 5 as the most confident logic. When we compare this then to, in this case, I'm showing 4 different sort of random selections of these 100 pixel flips. And in all of those cases, while they too can predict different labels than the original, the confidence with which they are predicting the incorrect label is actually less than what we're seeing in these cases for the R value, or flipping based on the R values. This suggests that the R values and this ordering can serve as a more systematic approach to introducing these kinds of perturbations and these kinds of potentially like adversarial attacks. Most importantly, it seems that it serves as a good indicator of input sensitivity for these networks. So I'll just conclude here by summarizing the work that I've gone over here for this PhD defense and this PhD thesis. For the first section, I discussed how Lyapunov exponents of recurrent neural networks are related to their performance. In particular, for this work, we outlined how these Lyapunov spectra can be computed and calculated for RNNs. And while I didn't discuss it in detail here, for that work, we also introduced some efficient code for calculating or for computing those quantities. We then demonstrated for a couple different tasks how the correlation between the maximal Lyapunov exponent or the mean Lyapunov exponent is correlated with the how they are correlated with the performance, even though it might be limited and we might be not exploring that relation completely. We then find also that that general spectrum properties, such as the mean value or the gross shape of those spectra, emerge quite early in training. We then build on these results in the second section, entitled Inferring Network Performance through Lyapunov Exponent Representation, by constructing an autoencoder that is able to capture this relation in more detail or with a more clear sort of interpretation, where we're able to find this distinction between high accuracy and low accuracy networks. Notably, it's capable of doing this across a wide variety of network hyperparameters, being initialization parameter, network size, network type, and even training progress. Finally, we look at a more sort of single or small scale example, looking at the contribution of individual components to the learning gradient in the section entitled Linking Finite Time Lyapunov Exponents to RNN Gradient Subspaces and Input Sensitivity. And as I was just describing, we demonstrated in this section how we can decompose and derive an expression for the Jacobian, which is in the form of these components that form the calculation and computation of the finite time Lyapunov exponents, namely the Q vectors and R values. We find that the Q vectors corresponding to the directions of greatest expansion in the hidden space or in the hidden state tend to be aligned with the dominant directions of the gradient. And we find that the R values, the largest R values, tend to serve as effective indicators of input sensitivity to a degree that is significantly greater or greater than than randomly flipping pixels would. So I'd like to conclude by just once again acknowledging the people who helped me with all of this research and supported me throughout this process. So my PhD advisor, Eli Shlizerman. As Eli mentioned, a lot of this work was also supported by Guillaume Lejoie when I was in Montreal at Mila and UDM, and then a couple co-authors on these papers that that formed the previous sections. Maximilian Plomos-Duzel at Mila, and then Yang, who worked with me on the AELLE paper. And then finally, I just have a few organizations listed at the bottom here, as well as some funding sources which supported this research. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So looks like we are right about that time. Great job. Ryan Lee, by the way, that's the name.
Ryan, yeah.
So we can proceed to questions from a general audience, and I will try to monitor both chat for the Zoom attendees. So you don't worry about that.
Okay,
Ryan, I will try to handle it.
Thank you.
And also questions from the audience in person. Let's start the QA.
Okay, Raj.
So many, but I'll start with one. So basically, so like these Lyapunov exponents, so you can calculate them during training.
So yeah, that's a good question. As of right now, they are considerably more computationally expensive than just calculating a gradient at a single time step. Usually the way we would do it is at the end of like an epoch, we would train it, we would calculate or compute these exponents. There can be some, like, we've been trying to look into ways that we can make it more efficient, but ultimately it's hard to parallelize anyways, because it's a long sequential asymptotic quantity. So doing that in the course of training is generally challenging, but theoretically it could be used. It's not entirely clear how to make that feasible though, especially for larger networks.
Gotcha. I mean, so my question was heading more towards like, so, I'm sure you've heard of this phenomenon of double descent, right? So this happens right? So effectively, so do you see this phenomenon? If you see this phenomenon in recurrent neural networks, right? Like at that transition where you see double descent, does your dynamic sort of have this drastic change where you stabilize and somehow something happens And so could this be a proxy for that?
Yeah, so certainly as a metric, like if you identify the location at which that's happening, you could measure, you could perform this for the network before and after that happens and analyze this as a proxy or a metric for those dynamics, but it's not necessarily something that you do directly in line as like part of a regularization procedure as of right now.
But yeah, it'd be interesting to see if this sort of tells you this is why it's happening in the context of RNN. So these continuous.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it didn't discuss this in too much detail because there was a lot of things that we could build on with this. Certainly, if we identify what looks to be like an optimal spectrum, one thing we've been talking about is how could we change how we compute the Lyapunov exponent so that it's more stable for backpropagation, because QR over a long sequence can be unstable if you need to backpropagate along that. So yeah, there's some interesting possible directions that could go in that are related to that. But right now, I think it's too computationally expensive to consider that as an inline kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Also with early stopping, you can sort of see this as a marker.
Exactly. Yeah. So the last slide of the AELLE we thought of as a potential indicator for like choosing to do early stopping, particularly if it's identified as being a low accuracy network early on. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting part. So I have a question about the very last section where you use the exponent to predict which directions are the perturbations necessitated in this group, right? So I wonder if you thought about what like you use your method to apply your method to like a wide range of network architecture, particularly logical and predict which input they are most robust to and
So that is a great point, because that idea is certainly that it inspired this work. I will say this is like hot off the press. This was submitted to NeurIPS like a week ago. And so future directions of how this could be applied are certainly like something we need to consider. But I will say like the idea behind that when we were working, this was something that I did at Mila with Guillaume. That is definitely something we'd like to investigate further. How exactly to extend this for larger networks, like I mentioned, there's a significant computational cost, especially when like trying to do these kind of comparisons over. These were very big tensors in Gen, like millions or billions of even for relatively small networks. So this kind of method would probably have to be refined once you start looking at more complex things. But the intuition behind it, I think, still would be very interesting and could extend to anything where you can measure those dynamics. Yes.
Have you tried applying this for continuous networks?
Yeah, so that we haven't done just yet. There is, it's certainly with the algorithm that I'm not going to be able to make with it. In the algorithm that we were looking at, it is dependent on being able to have like an explicit expression for the Jacobian. As of right now, like the code that I wrote for this. So here, like this J here is actually where the primary advancement that we made in terms of computational efficiency came from by calculating this analytically. I would say in general, if you can get like a clear and consistent and correct expression for that Jacobian, I would say, at least I'd hypothesize it's something you could at least use as an analysis tool. The effectiveness of it on networks in general, I'm not 100% sure about. Yes.
You mentioned out of this something reporter.
Yes. So for the particular implementation of the QR decomposition that we're using, we look for yes. 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 Exactly. So you might note that the largest network size I ever referred to in this whole thing was 512. That is now admittedly, that is the size of the hidden state. Now for gated variables or for gated architectures like LSTM, where even though the number of parameters in the network is like, scales like 4 times what the same hidden size for an RNN would be, the size of the QR decomposition would still be the same. So in terms of limiting factor for that is like in terms of size, 512 is what we looked at. I also tried to do things where I didn't need like a high performance, like a big cluster or anything. But if you have access to like a lot of memory, you could, but you're right, it scales quadratically. So it becomes considerably more challenging as it gets larger. We haven't really explored too many ways of like compressing this a ton. But having demonstrated that these could have some usefulness, we might in the future ourselves or leave it to other people at some point to determine how to make this viable for larger networks.
All right, a question from Zoom. Do you think Lyapunov exponents could also inform the future generalization capabilities of a network?
I mean, I think they could help to inform some of that. I think what we were trying to lean into, particularly with this comparison across network architecture, is that even though the sort of like geometric structure of how each of these networks is actually propagating this information forward in terms of using the gated mechanisms with LSTM and GRU, or using some sort of dynamic constraints on what the weight matrices are, we still have this unifying framework in the context of the dynamics as measured by Lyapunov exponents, that we're comparing them all across in relation to performance together. So I think that could serve, at least from that perspective, could help in aiding that kind of research. Yeah.
So I have a question about the part where you studied the latent space of an autoencoder that was trained on reconstruct Lyapunov exponents. So if I get it right, the latent space that it learns is purely data.
Yes.
And it depends on multiple factors. So like the architecture of the autoencoder itself, the size of the latent space, what we feed into it. So I'm curious about your thoughts, like how general the conclusions that we get from studying that space are with respect to all of that, you know,
The very
aspects of the experiments that might change and thus may lead to maybe different representations of what.
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a great point. I will say, I mean, we did vary some aspects of it, such as like the well, first of all, at least we thought that by doing it across like different choices of network hyperparameters, that might extend at least, and we got consistent patterns across all of them. While it's not exactly saying, oh, we tested all possible combinations of network architect or of like autoencoder architectures, we still get some of these sort of patterns that emerge here. I think, as I tried to motivate earlier, I think the fact that also we have this, the emphasis on the latent space and the representation in that space, as opposed to like specifically what's the performance of the autoencoder. We don't really reference the loss or like the training of the autoencoder itself as like a, because it's really just used as a tool that we can extract these things. This work was more a demonstration that this isn't necessarily the single best and only way to do this, but that this is something that can be done using just the Lyapunov exponents. And so, of course, you know, if you want to try some different combination of latent size, of you want to use I don't know, really crazy choices for your encoder and decoder, yep, feel free to do it. Just give it the Lyapunov exponents and then try and train it. And I'm willing to bet you'll get something like this. How effective it is and how well it will work, you're right, might depend on some of those choices.
Maybe to follow on this question, so could you like then go back and kind of like see what the autoencoder will capture in those spectrum curves?
Yeah, that's I don't know if I have this.
Is there something general about all these different scenarios that
yeah, so
investigate?
one thing we've been exploring, and I apologize, I don't actually think I have this included in my extra slides here, but because this is a linear layer that it is outputting here, you know, that just means it's taking a single matrix that goes from the dimensionality of this latent space to, in this case, it's just a single number. So it's one dimensional as its output. That means that this is a linear function which can have like zeros, or it's scaling, or it's mapping into a one-dimensional space. So if we say we want to choose a particular loss, then we might be able, unfortunately, like I said, I don't have the slide for it, but we can locate the location, or you can find the locations in this space, in this two-dimensional space, where the loss would be predicted to be zero. And then using that decoder, we can actually show what it predicts the corresponding Lyapunov spectrum to look like for that. Now, part of the reason I didn't include it here is it doesn't seem to be super robust, and it gives spectra that don't make a ton of sense and don't line up perfectly with what we would see in particular architectures. But if that's the kind of thing that we're specifically trying to learn and specifically trying to extract, we could, kind of like what Alex was referring to here, change what hyperparameters we have, maybe look at some regularization on the loss of the autoencoder to encourage that kind of like behavior and investigation. Yeah, great. So just for anyone on Zoom, so the question was whether we could consider using a variational autoencoder instead of just a standard autoencoder to perform this. I think that could be possible. I haven't looked into that in too much detail. I think at first I wanted there to have a sort of like specific and not necessarily statistical representation of the Lyapunov exponents when performing this analysis in the latent space. But particularly when looking at maybe like a larger number of networks or trying to capture like I don't know, different properties or like different sort of statistical distributions of these Lyapunov spectra, using a variational approach could be interesting.
Okay, I don't see more questions on Zoom, and we are at the time for like an hour of the presentation. So I suggest we thank Ryan for the. We also thank the audience for really great discussion and questions and attending both in person and on Zoom. This is really great. We have really great attendance. So really appreciate it. And now we'll transition to further discussion with the committee.
Thank you everyone for attending, everyone on Zoom, as well as everyone in person. I really appreciated you getting to witness this with me.